Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Creator in Conversation. Today's episode, I'm very excited to share with you. It's with Mr. Paul Kupperberg. Paul is actually the first person to write a comic book miniseries with the world of Krypton. In our conversation with Paul, again, he was very kind in joining us on a particular weekend, and not just myself, but students and members of TASQ Art. We were able to ask him about his career. Those of you who are excited for the new upcoming Superman film from James Gunn, you may have also seen James's TV series Peacemaker, which featured the character Vigilante, also heavily associated with Paul, who wrote a lot of that version of Vigilante back in the 80s as well. And that comes up in our conversation, and I really appreciate and thank Paul for his candid and responses. He was very transparent, very open about his experiences, and just gave really invaluable insight into the inner workings of the industry, both what has happened in the past, back when he was working with companies like DC, and also a little bit about what's currently happening. When you go to the cinema and you see these characters up on the big screen, how does that translate, if anything, monetarily back to the creators as well? So that was really interesting. And we also got to talk a little bit about E. Nelson Bridwell as well, who was, he's probably one of the guys I wish I could have had a conversation with. He just seems like such a character, and Paul gave us some real insight to that gentleman as well. So again, sit back, relax and enjoy, and I'll see you at the flip side. So welcome back, everyone, to this episode of Creator in Conversation. Joining us today is Mr. Paul Kupperberg, and thank you again, Paul, for joining us. It's a
pleasure.
No, likewise, and I literally pulled from my shelves here
Wow.
one of my favorite miniseries, but I was also fascinated to discover it's technically the first comic book miniseries as well, with the world of Krypton.
Yeah, the first intentional comic miniseries. There had been many before that got canceled after 3 or 4 issues, but we planned to only go for three issues. Yeah.
And so that preempts one of the questions. That was always an intention to do a miniseries. Why was it never, do you feel, like the standard that people didn't want to go with the tree? Was it like an oversaturation, or was it just
Well,
like a
you have to kind of go back in time for this. This was 1978, 9. And the bulk of distribution for comic books in those days was done on the newsstand, which was, we're used to comic shops these days where you can go in and say, I want you to get me this issue of, and the guy will bring it in. So you never have to miss an issue. In the old days on the newsstand, you were always missing issues. Distribution was spotty. When I was a kid, my neighborhood in Brooklyn, on Tuesdays, which was New Comic Book Day in those days, my friends and I would go around to 4 or 5 different candy stores and drugstores and newsstands to get everything because no one place carried it. So a miniseries where there were only 3 or 4 issues, that was problematic. Somebody may get the first and then miss the second and third, so it just didn't fit the model. Also, it took like 6 months to get sales figures, final sales figures back from the newsstand. So, if you want to do a miniseries, you're not going to find out, how bad it tanked until 3 months after it's over. So for that reason. But this was kind of special circumstances at the time. It had originally been created as a 3-issue arc for a comic called Showcase, which was a well-known book in American comics. It was where the Flash was launched, and the Atom and Green Lantern, and all these kind of reset the superhero comics in the 1950s and early 60s. So this was part of Showcase. Showcase got canceled. The Superman movie got pushed back a year, and we got to a point where we needed product. DC needed product to take advantage of the Superman movie, and somebody remembered this was sitting in the drawer, so they decided they just toss it out there on its own as a miniseries. And again, special circumstances. So they took a chance and it worked.
Yeah, no, and it's really it's one of these stories that constantly it seems to be a good reference point for many subsequent writers, because I can see particularly in Mark Waid on Action Comics at the moment, he just did a run, kind of his Return to Krypton story, which seems to be
Mhm.
generational these days. It seems that each one has a Return to Krypton, but a lot of the material, it's great to see it. Like we often see it in class that Superman outside of America here in Ireland and such. It's really interesting. Our perspective is we see Superman as your mythology, like that's
Sure.
the American myth as we see it. Then, and it's just interesting to see like some of these stories here collected previous from the Silver Age, and now it's coming through onto it. It's really interesting. And there's a gentleman as well, E. Nelson Bridwell, who I've come across his name and his writings. He's also in the collected edition I have here from 2018.
Sure.
But strikes me as like he must have been a fascinating contemporary colleague. I have the Superman quiz book from, I think, was the tie-in material from the Superman movie as well,
Uh-huh.
and the knowledge that gentleman must have had seemed to be encyclopedic in what he gathered. What was it like working with Mr. Bridwell?
Nelson was a character for sure. He was like you say, he was encyclopedic, but it wasn't just comic books. He knew the Bible, he knew Shakespeare, he knew history. I mean, if you had a question, it would be like, "I'll be right back," and you'd go down the hall, and Nelson would have the answer for you. Um, yeah, interesting man. He was not well. He had a lot of a lot of physical problems and all that. And but sweet man. He never he always had an answer. He was always willing to talk. Actually, he was always willing to talk too much sometimes. we we kind of we had it was cruel, but it was kind of necessary. You'd go into somebody and go, "Look, I'm going to talk to Nelson. Could you come and get me in 15 minutes? Julie needs me or whatever." Because you had to get rescued from Nelson. He was fascinating, and I did spend a lot of time, talking to him, just because he knew so much, and but sometimes you just needed to have a backup plan.
Yeah, he would have got on well over here in Ireland. We've all the gift of the gab here. He would have he would have found a second home among us.
Yeah. No, unfortunately he was abused at DC.
Oh,
Mort
terrible.
Weitzinger was not a nice man to begin with. I mean, he abused everybody. But Nelson was easy to kick around. And even Julie Schwartz, who I loved, mistreated Nelson. But again, he was so meek and mild. It was just like you could call him an idiot and get away with it. But yeah, a sweet man. I really I enjoyed his company. He was he was exasperating to work for sometimes. With the world of Krypton, he was kind of helped me with. I mean, I knew most of this stuff myself, but Nelson kind of provided a backup outline of all the events from the history to include in the plot. But then a couple of years later, we did the Secrets of the Legion of Superheroes miniseries,
Mhm.
which Nelson and I co-wrote. Nelson plotted it, and I scripted it. And Nelson, talk about stuffing 50 pounds into a 20-pound sack. So he didn't want to leave anything out. So he tried to cram way too much in. But
Oh yeah, no, he was like a walking Wikipedia before Wikipedia
oh,
existed.
absolutely, yeah.
And you mentioned a couple of the editors there as well. So Mort Weisinger, his reputation has even reached as far as us as well. Like in some cases, when we look at some of the Silver Age, Bronze Age Lex Luthor, so there's an interpretation. This is probably speculation among fans and readers, but they thought Lex Luthor might have been based physically interpreted by Mort just in appearance, and also this attitude might have come true. But with Julie Schwartz, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you might have delivered a presentation at Terrificon a while back that found its way into YouTube. Now, Terrificon's a fantastic convention out
Yeah.
in Mohican Sun. A mutual friend, John Suttress, knows
Sure.
the organizer, Mitch, and that's how I got to know it. But you gave a great presentation. I think it was a video presentation from Julie Schwartz. And,
Right. It was the somebody in 1988. Julie had put together a slide presentation, 15 Years of Superman, and he had it videotaped at a convention, and I. I was friendly with Julie, and I worked for him in the early and mid '80s. And then after he retired as an editor, he would come into DC every week. You know, he still had an office as editor emeritus. So, we all made it a point to make the pilgrimage and go talk to Julie, and make sure just keep in touch. And I would often walk into his office, and he'd be throwing stuff out. He'd be clearing out a cabinet or a desk or whatever. And I'd look into the trash can, and there would be, Julie, you can't throw this out. I'd started rescuing stuff. And Mark Waid also did it. He also pulled a lot of stuff out of the garbage that Julie was throwing away. And one of the things was this videotape. And he was tossing it. I said, "What's this?" He told me what it was. I said, "Wait, we shouldn't throw this out. I don't want it. So, all right, I'll keep it." And it literally sat in a box for 30 years until I found it again, and then I had it transferred to video, to digital, and put it online. It's up on my Patreon page now. It was all these slides and all this stuff he had collected over the decades, because Julie started at DC in 1944. And he had come off of before that, he'd been not only a science fiction fan and helped create some of the first fanzines, but became a science fiction literary agent with Mort Weisinger, and who were buddies they met at the science fiction club that they both belonged to. And so Julie spent 10 years as a literary agent for everybody from Ray Bradbury to Edmund Hamilton to whatever. He very and then in 1944 he got hired to come to DC, and he said he'd never read a comic book before that. They used to have a term for comics. They used to call them squinkers, because you had to kind of squint. Yeah, you got to kind of squint your eyes to read them. So.
We got to bring that back. We got to bring that back.
Yeah. Instead of much better than floppies.
Yeah. True.
So he said he picked up a few comic books and read them on the train ride uptown to DC's office, National Periodical Publications offices in those days, and got hired and spent the next 40 plus years there.
It's incredible, and it's amazing to see the crossover connection between science fiction and pulps and comics, and the real sense I feel nostalgic for is many of the stories of creators that we know today. They basically just walked up to an office, arranged an in-person interview. Now a lot of it seems to be conventions, social media. It's how would you feel if you were to alter the timelines and you were to break into the industry today? Would you feel that there'd be more opportunities because of the software, or do you think it'd be more limited than when it was when you first started?
I think it's more limited because you've got this, you've got this between us.
Yeah.
So, back in my day when I was a boy, look, back in the early 70s, I met Paul Levitz when we were 12, 13 years old. In fact, I was at Paul's bar mitzvah. So, yeah, we go back that far. We met in middle school, and me and another friend, Steve, and Paul were like the only kids in the school who read comics. So we got together, did all kinds of stuff, did these crud zines and Xerox zines and mimeograph and all that. And then in 1971, we started a fanzine called Etc., which was a news and information fanzine. And that took off, and Paul parlayed that he didn't parlay that. It turned into a job, a summer job at DC for Joe Orlando that, lasted a few years. Um, and and so we had the fanzine and we had access. So we were New York fans, which was very helpful because Marvel, DC, everybody had an office in New York, even if they Gold Key was out in Wisconsin, but they still had New York offices, and Charlton even had a little office. They were in Derby, Connecticut, a small town here in Connecticut, and but even they had a drop off office in the city. So that was where you went. That was where you had to come to break into comics. We were already there. We had the access. We had the fanzines. We had been walking around. I started going up to DC in 1971. Just as a fan, and at some point the receptionist knows your face, and it's like you walk in. It's like yeah, go in. So I mean, that's changed greatly.
I can imagine.
First, you have to get onto the Warner Brothers studio lot, and then yeah. But anyway, yeah. So it was. I mean, it wasn't. Access-wise, it was not difficult for me to. It wasn't difficult for me to break into comics. I had a streak of lucky breaks. It had to be that because it certainly had nothing to do with talent at the time. So yeah, it just, now people say, how do you break into comics? And my answer is, well, okay, first go back to 1971. I mean, I don't know how you would do it today. I do tell them I do know it's all up on the internet. It's all up online. You have to get your comics out there. You have to make noise, but there's a lot of noise out there. So getting it heard. I'm part of a group of authors. We have a pub. It's not a publishing company. It's a publishing hub called Crazy 8 Press. Yep. And we all publish our books under the Crazy 8 imprint. Not that anybody has any say over what the other person publishes, but just that we have strength in numbers to promote our stuff. So, we're just not promoting our individual work. We're promoting the Crazy 8 as a whole. I mean, the only reason to do that is because you got 10 people make a lot more noise than one person.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, that's what it's come to.
It is nice. The way I've heard it put to me a couple of times is that it used to be the audience would go out and seek content. And now what it is that those who create the content, have to go out and seek and find our audience. It's kind of inverted now because, as you said, there's so much choice. Crazy 8, I've been following. It's been great. Everyone's collaboration. There's a couple of familiar faces as well, and names like Elias Magin had recently contributed something. I think a short story with you guys.
Yes, in Thrilling Adventure Yarns 2025. That's the 4th volume of kind of pulp-inspired adventure stories, edited by Robert Greenberger, who was also a DC Comics alumnus. Yeah, Elliot has a story of the recent volume. So does Christopher J. Priest, who is one of my favorite writers.
Yep.
And not Christopher Priest, because Christopher Priest got pissed off at Christopher J. Priest. And the names sent DC a letter saying, tell him to stop using my name. I don't want any confusion. And the editor, Brian Augustin, wrote him back and said, well, first of all, I asked around and nobody here has heard of you, so don't worry about confusion. and second of all, that's his legal name, so no, we can't ask him to change it.
That's some comeback. No one say that's a bond. That's like some Eminem rapper kind of origin story right there.
Yeah.
But and correct me if I'm wrong, but so you have. It's really interesting. Your career. You've done comic strips, comic books, and then prose adaptations as well. So back in the day, the pocket books.
I've written Mad Libs. I've written everything.
Was JSA Ragnarok? Did you release that through Crazy 8 as well? Because I remember I picked up. Yeah, that's brilliant. I picked up. That was an interesting turn of events. Because that was I think there's a tragic underline to it. Because the original publisher sadly passed away unexpectedly. There was an accident he was involved in, and
yeah, it was Yeah, it was Brian Price, who was the publisher of iBooks. Well, he was a Jewish guy driving to synagogue on Saturday morning in his Mercedes Benz. I think he was asking for it. I'm just saying, but
Oh God.
uh, no, it was tragic. I mean, I knew Byron but gotta admit that's funny. Uh,
It's a
anyway,
setup. The setup, all right.
yeah. No, yes, he was. Uh, iBooks was a very interesting publishing company. They published a wide variety of stuff from historic fiction. I mean, they were publishing Bill O'Reilly's, novels or Bill O'Reilly's novels. Um, so all kinds of different stuff. And they had this contract with DC to do a series of novels based on, there was JSA, there was Green Lantern. We did Crisis, novelization of Crisis, and some other stuff. Some of it got published. And in fact, literally the week Ragnarok was supposed to go to press was the week they went bankrupt.
Oh,
So so it never went to press, and it sat there for 15 years in wherever that stuff sits. Somebody picked up iBooks at the auction after the bankruptcy, and I tried to get him to publish it, but he wanted DC wanted him to pay for the book again, even though anyway, it was this whole mess. Finally, after all these years, I got in touch with someone at DC and a legal guy who I knew from my time there, and we talked about it and we worked out an arrangement. And I was able to self publish it.
no, it's great. It's a great novel as well. It's fantastic to see it available in print, and people can order that now as well through Crazy and on as an online store to order.
Yeah, it's
on print. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it's on Amazon and yeah, probably the best way to do it, because otherwise shipping is crazy.
And it looks like it's going to get even crazier, unfortunately. So let's see what the future
Everything is
holds.
getting crazier. Hold on.
It's the reason why I have the Joker card behind me here. Just setting the tone.
I'm just going to get a big banner that says, "We're fucked."
Yeah, that's it. Get straight to the point onto it.
Yeah.
And so, just in terms, I just want to jump across to your experience as well with comic strips, because you did some of the Superman comic strips as well. What was the difference like for you in terms of writing? Because obviously the pacing is different in terms of the serialization. But what's great is there's a couple of Facebook fan pages that seem to have found some of these materials, seem to be like resharing some of the old strips. And I'm an avid comic strip reader myself. I published the Phantom strips and Flash Gordon over here. And the students at the academy, helped in that process in doing cover work and such for it. But certain modern strips, you can see they get the pacing, they don't get the pacing. For you, what was it like? Did you find it a real challenge to shift gears from comics where you would have full issue to just like almost like an act a scene per day, per week?
Well, it's it's an interesting form to work in when you're doing a continuity strip, because you essentially have one panel a day to advance a story. Panel one is kind of bringing everybody up to speed. Panel two is new stuff, and panel three is the page turner, is to come back tomorrow. It was a different. Yeah, it did. It took me a couple of continuities, I think, to get the pacing down and stuff. But yeah, I loved it. I actually, once I got it, it was a lot of fun to work in. And, I grew up on newspaper strips. In New York, we had the New York Daily News, which had, a legendary Sunday section, color Sunday section. It's so important that it was wrapped around the newspaper. That was the front of the Sunday paper was the Dick Tracy. So, I grew up on that stuff. I loved newspaper strips, always wanted to do one. Unfortunately, by the time I got around to it, we had kind of gotten to it was a dying breed. The papers were dropping it, the size was shrinking, the pay. I mean, I never saw one printed in a newspaper. I never saw one of my Supermans printed in a newspaper. I don't think it was in that many papers by that time. So, yeah, I mean, I would have kept on writing it because of what it was, but it was paying page rate, and but yeah.
It's really, really interesting because there's new platforms and apps. I don't know if you've heard of Webtoons, for example. And they're basically just comic strips, but they have the advantage of they don't have to limit to a space on a newspaper page, but it's still shorter than a comic. But now people are using their phones and the screen and certain serialized formats. Like I see Eisner nominated creators now, and it's basically Instagram pages, serialized content, and of course, radio's come back in a big way thanks to podcasts. So it's like that which is old is new again.
Well, I remember a couple of years ago, they everybody was like, wow, isn't this great? And I was like, no, that's a Polaroid camera. We had those in 1970, but the Polaroid came back, right? That instant picture thing. Was like,
It did.
what's so exciting?
What it is as well, it's so funny you use that as an example because I was actually just talking about this with a friend over dinner last night, and it's kind of like when you go to an event now and you have your phone, you take the picture and then it goes up onto the cloud or wherever. But the idea of the Polaroid now is, well, it's a physical artifact, a memory of that time, so the sentimentality and all around. So yeah, people are going back to it. It's so interesting. It's like everything, I suppose, is cyclical in a way, and with comic books, more so, like it's a fascinating study because you're essentially asking an audience to pay what's coming up to $5 or €5 now a month for one chapter of a story in which, and then meanwhile,
It'll never end.
yeah, and it's true, and then you also for that time you could also pay for a whole streaming service for the month, and watch X, Y, and Z TV shows. It's just I don't think we will ever figure out the comic book reader or the fan base. Well, what drives, what compels. But this, it's not that I'm complaining as a collector and reader myself, but it is interesting how, I don't know, it might have been maybe from the 80s to the 90s, but have you felt that comics used to be you could buy a substantive story, and particularly in the Silver Age, you would have a 3-chapter novel and it'd be in the one issue. But now it's everything single chapter issues, and it's part of an arc, and it's like wait for the trade, and that kind of affects the sales then the single issues. What's your thoughts on, when did you ever notice when the shift and that happened, or why it might have happened to go from to one and done?
I was there, Charlie. Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, I got in and I started writing in 1975. And I grew up on that kind of, those one-off kind of stories. I mean, my generation of creators coming in had a more sophisticated view of comics than the guys we grew up reading. They thought it was childish, embarrassing, stuff they were working on. It's the famous story of Stan Lee in the 50s being asked what he did for a living and saying he writes children's literature. So these guys were just, doing it for a living. I mean, I would, I'd go up to a writer like Bob Haney and say, "Yo, tell me your secret, guru." And he goes, "Make sure you get the check." Well, all right. That's good advice. But this is, these guys this was their living. It was my living too. It was my job. But I think we had more invested in it than the previous generation. And there were exceptions. I mean, you met guys like Joe Orlando or Joe Kubert. These guys were just always digging in there, trying to, figure it out and trying to make it better. But a lot of them were just journeymen. They were, it was a gig, and they wanted to be doing other things. We wanted to do comics.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the major difference. Murray Boltinoff wanted to be a screenwriter and reporter, but he wound up doing comics. And for him, that he was depressed his entire life over that.
It's really interesting, the perception of comics just being for children. That was apparent as well over this side of the Atlantic. Now, a lot of the comics here in Ireland that we would have gotten would have been from the UK and would have been like children's focus. Like we have these anthologies called the Dandy and the Beano,
No,
which would have been, yeah,
I know Dennis the Menace.
oh. You know what's ironic is we print Dennis the Menace in an anthology here called Task Force, but it's the American Dennis the Menace. So it's like we're in direct competition with our neighbours next door with the with the British Dennis the Menace. But what's really interesting with British comics, particularly in the 70s and 80s, was because of the perception of this is for children, a lot of material really flew under the radar, like splitting commentary on Margaret Thatcher, and this is where the likes of Alan Moore, Mark Miller, Grant Morrison cut their teeth, and that seems to be then the magnet for when DC in America kind of became aware of these creators. They just went, "Whoa, this is interesting," and then but that was always the way. It was much more underground comics. There's a great exhibit called Anarchy in the UK, UK British Comics Uncovered. It was in the British Museum, the British Library a few years ago. And if you ever come across the catalogue, I think it might still be floating around on Amazon. I think it's a really insightful read because they take the history of dog comics, of British comics, all the way back to like Punch and Judy, the Puppet Show, and the Mr. Punch magazine. But as you were saying, it's really interesting that perception then of your peers when you were breaking in of it's just for kids, and it's true. Like it was children audience, you can't dissuade, but it's interesting the comparison to how the creators in the UK went, oh, well, I think this is kids stuff, so we'll do what we want because no one's going to pay attention. It's really interesting.
Well, here when you do kid stuff, that's where they pay attention.
Oh, really? Yeah, that's it. It's under more scrutiny. Yeah.
So hey, some people did, I'm sure. It was kind of like the whole. I'm reading a book about comedians and the history of comedy, and there's talk about the blacklist in Hollywood in the 1950s, and there was no more truth to. And they were afraid that communist propaganda was going to sneak this stuff into the movies and television stars, and most people were not interested in doing that, and those that did it would probably be subtle enough that frankly the average audience isn't even going to pick up on it. So the same thing with comics. It's like we can't let them rot the minds of children, and it's like, well, that's what children's minds are for. And that's what, and comic books, yes, they will rot your mind. Here I am, but not in a bad way. I think we became afraid of allowing kids to be creative and to have imagination. I mean, back when I don't know if we've become afraid of it. I think the internet has taken away some of that option. We didn't I had to make this stuff up in my head. My girlfriend's 7-year-old granddaughter just has to click on the link.
Yeah. The entertainment, the interaction with the medium is much different. Like it's so much more passive now where it can unfold before you. But even with a comic, something as simple as a comic, like it requires participation of the reader to fill in that space between the panel. It invites you to participate in the reading of it. Just as we kind of steer towards the element of, as you were saying, it's a click of a button now. Obviously, the one of the most disruptive elements now that's appearing within the industry is AI and its place, and lots of debates, not just within the industry and the medium, but just in general, like how AI could be used as a tool. Of course, there are some fantastic implications such as faster diagnosis in the medical industry and manufacturing, of course. But then the idea of generative AI when it comes towards that of art and storytelling, it's interesting. We're just a couple of weeks out at this point of recording from the March edition of Dublin Comic Con, and we've been coordinating actually with DC to do some portfolio reviews here this year. And one of the stipulations, of course, is like no generative AI, because there have been negative experiences where people have presented work and it turns out, oh no, wait, they just got this from a click of a button. Um, in this series, it's becoming a frequently asked question. Just as you talk, like what's everyone's individual perceptions, views, opinions. It's been ranging from some see it as a new emerging tool in the way that, you know, something like Photoshop at first people thought would cause the end of certain careers, but then only opened up new horizons. For others, they see it as a cheapening and of the craft, and a real concern from a socio-economic point of view that it will price out the ability. If you want an actual painting done by hand, to see an actual film with actual actors, there might come a stage you can't afford that, then it'd be reserved for the elite, and then we're left with generative AI as the option. Do you have any opinions? Is it something that's been flying on your radar? Have you just been staying clear of that discourse, or is there any opinions or thoughts?
I think it is it's a tool. It is a tool, but it's also a slippery slope. I have played around with it just to see what it does. And for instance, I'm working on a graphic novel, a nonfiction graphic novel about the story of medicine, the history of medicine and disease. So I could spend a week going online and researching and preparing an outline, a timeline of this material, or I could have AI prepared for me in 3 seconds, and then I could spend half a day going in and editing and fixing and adding and subtracting and all that, which I did, and that seemed to work. That's fine, as a tool to kind of do the grunt work. I don't think it's any different, frankly, than me using AI to transcribe the interviews for my books. It's a tool. Then I asked it to do some writing, very specific and very, and it was awful. It just, there is not even a way to revise it to make it usable. I mean, probably some people could have, but it certainly didn't sound like me. It certainly didn't, read like anything I would want to put my name on. So it's limited. And I think in the terms of fiction and in prose, it's going to be a lot longer before the stuff is is passable. But art is a different story. I mean, I see some art that you kind of you're pretty sure that's generated by AI, but it's not bad. But on the other hand, even if a human artist has created that, is it art? I don't know. I mean, okay, you guys got to type in all kinds of prompts and tell it what to create, but is that art? I don't know. I mean, I don't think so. I think art is a human hand. Art is a human eye. It's human feelings. There's no way you can convey to a machine, all of that. There aren't enough prompts to give it, to give it humanity, to give a piece of work humanity.
Yeah, it's have you ever read the original Planet of the Apes novel?
Sure, volumes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And what's fascinating is it was a much more philosophical text than it was science fiction, because the premise of the way when the astronauts returned to Earth, it wasn't that it was a time travel escapade. They had actually gone to another planet, but it's that mankind became lazy, just gave up, stopped using its mind. It's when you look at it, it's like some of these stories that have been written decades in the past, now it's never become more relevant, when we look at it. And it's almost like, I'm a student of history, and we were always told, those who fail to learn from the past doomed to repeat it, as they say. And it now sounds cliche, but it seems to become more and more real every day. But that, I suppose, is why we turn to these stories of heroes, or just fiction in general. They inspire, they cause debate, and how we make them, the craft behind it. It's always great to have engaging conversations, to reach out with fellow like-minded individuals, even if they have a different perspective. I think that's the beautiful thing of art, is different perspectives make it live forever. with regards to the historical aspect, you mentioned like some of your other books, Direct Conversations, which is like an oral history of the comic book industry and your career and some of your peers as well. Is it
Right.
currently in? There's a couple of volumes to Direct Conversations. Is there? Is like it's on its second volume, or is it?
Well, technically three. The first one was Direct Currents, which were back in the 80s and 90s. I used to write a I'm sorry, the monthly shop giveaway. It was
Yeah.
called DC Direct. Yeah, DC Direct Currents. So I wrote that thing. It was a monthly thing. It was uh, capsule descriptions of all the of upcoming books, some feature articles about whatever they were promoting that month, and one of the features was a monthly interview with an artist, a creator, or whatever book was being pushed that month. So I did over 90 of those over the course of the years, and I would do an interview with creator and transcribe it and then cut it down and turn it into kind of a feature article format. So I didn't use I used maybe 30, 40, 50% of the interviews, and the rest I kept the raw transcripts. I didn't keep all of them, but years later I found an old floppy disk with a couple of dozen that had survived, and I was able to salvage those and turn those into a book called Direct Comments. I just edited them down to I made them coherent and added a lot of footnotes because it was 30-year-old conversations talking about stuff that happened probably 30, 40 years before that. So yeah, that was the first one. And then after that, it had a good reception, but I was out of stuff to repurpose. So I just I decided to talk to the people I knew from the early '70s who I broke into the business with, and that was Direct Conversations. And I talked to Paul Levitz and Jack C. Harris and Steve Mitchell, a whole bunch of people. And then after that, I did Direct Creativity, which was talking with a bunch of creators about how they go about creating, more their inspiration, how they got into comics and what inspired them. And I just started doing interviews for the next book, so I got more of that coming.
That's brilliant. And the Direct Creativity, that must have been a really tough. Well, to me, I would imagine it'd be tough because the one thing I always know is when you're at a convention or you're talking to a crowd and you say, well, where do you get your ideas from or what inspires you? They just give me the look of death straight away. It's like, you've asked the one question you must never ask a creator.
It's a subscription service out of Albuquerque, New Mexico. Every month they send us ideas and we take what we want. No, that's the glib answer. The real answer is that's my job. Where do you get your ideas? Yeah, my ideas, I like to pay my rent. So I need that idea. So yeah, it really is. Yeah, it really is a job. And it really is kind of, and my mind, I can't speak for other people's minds and certainly don't want any speaking for mine, but, I'm always, the ideas are just always coming. Most of them are useless, but, it's never hard to come up with an idea, at least. Yeah. But again, that's why I do this.
I think it was in a recent podcast, Rob Liefeld was discussing, he visited Jack Kirby at home in the 90s and saw him at the original drawing board, saw his work, and he was just asking like, what was it like? And he said he could do like on average nearly 3 pages a day. And you do like 6-day weeks, so you would need to be knocking out a comic more or less within a week, and it's an incredible output. And they asked him straight up, like, how could you do it? And he goes, well, I had overheads, I had a family to support, so that was there wasn't like a question of you had the other options. You had to do it. So that is true, and that's something that I really appreciate. Is I think there's still, I think sometimes when people look at the history of comics, they definitely lean towards the stories, the creativity, the art history of it. but there's a lot to be said for just the blue collar working class side of it, the people, the human cost of it, the work that
Yeah,
went
well,
into it.
the business side of it is really, it's called the comic book business,
Mhm.
you know, and it really is. People forget that you get you're overwhelmed by you know, it's like, oh my God, I'm writing Superman, I'm working on Batman, and whatever it is that you dreamed of doing, and you're finally doing it, and there's a tendency to forget that if you don't do it well enough, you're out. You're not
Yeah.
going to still be doing it. So I'm fortunate in that very early on, I wound up working, on staff at DC, on the promotional side and the business side. I had a bunch of times when I went on staff. Once was in '77. I was assistant to the PR manager. Then I came back and I was the PR manager, just at the kind of the dawn of the direct market. Roger Slifer and I were dealing with the direct market. Then I came back and I was as an editor, but as an editor, I worked not only in editorial, but I worked in licensed publishing. I worked in licensing. I worked in, so all kinds of, so I kind of saw my way around. I see beyond the comic books. I see, what it takes to get them out there. Most, I think, creators just kind of come and go. It's like DC is a comic book company. DC is an IP company. Always was. They just happen to publish comic books back then is the main way of this, getting the IP out there. But they don't want to hear that because Superman, Batman, Neil Adams, Gil Kane. Oh my God,
It's interesting as well as we look at the IP nature of DC as well. Like a huge dimension to comic books now have, of course, been the films, the blockbuster movies that have been coming out. These are like billion-dollar enterprises, and it's been great to see the acknowledgement. And when it is awarded to the creators, I know James Gunn has been very public in acknowledging your contributions as well, particularly with the Peacemaker series with Vigilante, but also it's fair to say as well that's a different interpretation as well. Like aesthetically, there might be similarities with the name and the character, and then differences. Yeah. How have you found just seeing like maybe something you might have contributed or inspired being reinterpreted then in a different medium? Have you been a fan, or is it just something that's more in your passing?
Well, as far as what I understand, again, having been on the business side of things, I'm fine. I know you have to change things for the movies. I know what works in the comic book page might not work on the screen, and I also understand that the movie producers are assholes who think they're going to tell us how to do it and are going to fix everything. Okay, that's part of the deal. So they're going to come in and do what they do. I could get upset about it, but why bother? I can't do anything about it. Yes, James Gunn has been very nice in acknowledging my contributions to Peacemaker and Vigilante, and happy to have it. Would rather have the cash, but still, the credit is nice.
Mm-hmm.
It's nice to see my name on the screen at the end of a movie or a TV show. That's swell, but and we do get royalties. We do get, those aren't royalties; those are whatever they call them. But we get payments for this type of stuff if they use our stuff in movies and TV. But I'm thinking, compared to what they get, yeah, I don't. Yeah, that's a nice. That's hardly a nice gesture. I mean, I know people have gotten big chunks of change for things, but Paul Levitz is gone, and that ain't going to be happening much anymore, I think. So
yeah, it's true. I remember I first became aware of Paul Levitz. This is going to sound terrible, but it was actually through the Batman Begins film because they had the DVD extras and they would do the interviews. But then subsequently, a lot of creators have said that like Mr. Levitz, he was the one responsible for arranging for, I think it was actually Denny O'Neill with John Suttress in conversation, was saying he's the one to say, well, look, here's the contract, and if you sign this now, you'll get like this lump sum. Or if you sign this, go back, get your legal counsel, you could get the recurring payments then. And the general consensus seems to be about with Marvel and DC, those type of conversations or that kind of consideration, looking out for the creators, doesn't seem to be as prevalent now. I'm complete outsider on all this. So I'm just,
I don't think you get a choice anymore. I think you're just, you will get your whatever the contractual, you sign a standard contract, which is a 10% royalty on whatever DC gets. But remember, DC is selling the rights to these things to Warner Brothers.
Mm-hmm.
So they're selling it to a sister company that they're going to be getting, they're not going to be charging the going market rate because this is an intercompany thing. So, they can sell it for $8 and get me my 80 cents,
Yeah.
Listen, when I got into comics, I never expected to see another penny other than page rate. So I knew what I was getting into. In fact, when I started, there was still the stamp on the back of the check. There was a rubber stamp that said, by signing this, you acknowledge full payment and agree that this is entirely work made for hire for whatever company, DC or Marvel, and you have no claims. And you endorsed a check to cash it, you're signing away all your rights. 1976, that got overturned and changed. But when I started, I was still signing away, in order to cash my paycheck, I was signing away my right. So, any royalties I get, great. It's gravy. But, since they're giving the gravy, they could give a better portion.
True, very true. And it seems to be speaking to the general consensus within the industry that I think Robert Kirkman was perhaps the first to be the most vocal about it, but it used to be people would do like indie books to try and break in to work for the main companies, DC and Marvel. But now it's almost like you walk in DC and Marvel to launch your own indie book, your own creator-owned book then, because you have full creative control. And it's really interesting within the mainstream media. It's difficult, I would say, competitive, but healthy competition if you're an artist trying to break in, because there's portfolio reviews and such. But to be a writer to break into comics for DC or Marvel, as you mentioned, they see them now as IP farms, which again, Mr. Levitt's had brilliant idea in that strategy, because it convinced Warner Brothers that, keeping DC Comics will allow them to develop an IP that becomes the next blockbuster trilogy of games, films, etc. But now you would have to have experience almost writing for TV, working on IPs before perhaps, like, you don't go to them, they will go to you as the writer, because they want the next writer. They be like, well, this could inspire the next $1 billion at the box office, so they won't just give it to somebody. It's interesting. It's a shame sometimes when I see these circumstances, like as you said, the business of it. But who knows? Hopefully, with everything, the many shifts within the industry, we'll see. I know there's been attempts both in Marvel and DC to have like talent camps and such to bring in new creators and give a platform. Hopefully, we see.
Yeah, I know in the past, I remember there were, in the 70s, there were, DC did portfolio reviews at conventions, they would send Joe Orlando or Sal Harrison to review portfolios. And in fact, when I was on staff, every year or two, the Kubert School would send over a busload of students with their portfolios, and we'd all sit in the big conference room and review these guys. That is important, but I don't think that's where you're going to find the talent. I think you mentioned writers coming from TV. It's like, it's so much more difficult for a writer to get in than it is for an artist. An artist, you can look at 3 pages and kind of figure out if they got it or not. With a writer, you've got to read. Even one story isn't going to tell you. You need to. So it's easy to look at the art and just. It's easy to look at the art and just go, oh, this guy's got it. But for writers, you have to. It's a commitment of time. You got to sit down and read 3 scripts or 2 short stories or whatever it is. So.
Absolutely. And as far as being a visual medium, the emphasis will always be
Sure.
on what the audience sees first. Absolutely. Thanks again, Paul, for your time. I just want to, before we bring things to a wrap and a close, I just want to throw it to some of the students attending, if there's any questions and wants to come in on it. This one.
Yes. Yeah, no. So I actually did have. I was thinking about this question for a minute, and I was trying to think to myself why I'm asking it. And I think the reason is that I romanticize comics from the 1970s. I grew up on 2000 AD from about the runs from about 1978 to 1983 were the first comics I ever read. We had all of them in the attic.
Sure.
But I know that they've gone back full circle on 2000 AD and are now basically redoing the first run of those comics in almost the exact same style as they did. But I wanted to ask you, because you were you were working full tilt at it back then, is there any sort of best practice or attitude towards comics or the making of comics from when you began that you think would serve people to maybe bring back as a common practice, or might have fallen under the radar as things went digital or as time went on, that you think if you were to give advice to one of your peers who's working on comics and you told them, you know something, there's something we used to do back in the day, it's very simple or it's very complicated, whichever.
Fun. The stories were fun. The business was fun. It was DC Comics, Marvel was the same way. I didn't hang out at Marvel much, but DC in the mid '70s was kind of like, back in those days we got paid twice a week. So if you got your story in by Monday, you'd get a check on Wednesday. If you got it in by Wednesday, you'd get a check on Friday. So always living check to check. You could go up, and also being in the office was, you'd walk up and down the hall and some editor would go, "Hey, I need a 10-pager. Can you do it?" So that was it. It was a very tight community. There were softball games, there were poker games. We were always going out to dinner and lunch and hanging out. Even you'd show up on Friday at DC, and there was a couch at the end of the hall, and everybody would just hang out around there waiting for checks to come down because you had to run to make the 3:00 bank closing. So it was. That kind of that community, I guess, is transferred over to conventions to a certain extent, because back in those days there were 2 conventions a year. Now there's one practically every weekend. So but still, you weren't everybody was in New York, and so you'd walk in and there's Len, and there's Bertie Wrightson, and there's Mike Kaluta, and there's this guy and that guy, and we were just there. And it was, I was on a podcast, and the guy was asking me about my first work for DC, and it was a 10-pager for Superman Family in 1975, and I said, yeah. So I went up to DC, and and I sat down with Denny O'Neil, and plotted out this stuff. And he goes, "You mean you sat down with Denny O'Neil?" Well, yeah, that's what we used to do. We'd go into the office and we'd sit down, but that's Denny O'Neil. You plotted it. He couldn't believe that I could have been face to face with the Denny O'Neil. And yes, I'm impressed by Denny. I love Denny. He was one of the best writers this business has ever seen. But he was Denny. Yeah. But yeah, that kind of that sense is just gone. I don't. I feel that amongst the amongst my peers, but maybe again, I don't hang out with these guys, so maybe I'm just missing it. But all the connection seems to be virtual these days. But yeah, I think the sense of fun, the sense of adventure, I think the stories are taken a little too seriously. And I think we take ourselves a little too seriously. It's comic books, for crying out loud. Just back, yeah. When I was reading comic books, you could read Superman or you could read Jerry Lewis. There was a wide variety of material.
Brilliant.
That's a Very good. Thank you so much. Because I'm bringing the fun back, Paul. I
Bring the
promise you.
fun back. It's not brain surgery. It's not even band-aiding a boo-boo. It is just, it is just writing stories about ridiculous people who wear tight clothes and can fly. I mean, if you start taking that too seriously, it starts to look silly. Again, I may just be, I'm no longer the reader. I am no longer the audience for comic book. I'm 70 years old. I've got, 60 years of reading this stuff, 65 years of reading this stuff behind me. You ain't showing me nothing I haven't seen. So, but still, I just think it's we've gotten way too intense.
I think people are finding that as well in the film adaptations. This films do that, and as they go back to have fun again. And like there used to be, I'm pretty sure maybe it was Superboy. He actually appeared in a comic called More Fun Comics, I think it was called. Like the More Fun used to be.
More Fun Comics number 105, I think. Yes.
So there you go. Like there used to be right there in the title of the book.
Yes.
And, yeah, no, who knows?
The Spectre also debuted in More Fun. So.
Oh well, there we go then as well. I suppose it depends on your idea of fun, I suppose. No, that's brilliant. Thanks so much for that question, thanks so much for the answer, Paul. Is there any other questions on the flow? Super. So
I'm so complete in my answers that there are no questions left unanswered.
This is great, Paul. Just before we wrap up, you mentioned you had a Patreon page. So that's patreon.com is underneath your name that people search to find it. Great. And what are you offering via Patreon? Is it, you mentioned some video-based content and others?
I'm just throwing up different kind of stuff. I am actually putting up the Superman newspaper strip. I was starting from pretty much the beginning of my run of it, and I've also my brother Alan had drawn the little orphanette, the Annie newspaper strip in the early 2000s. So I'm publishing his Sundays, the scans of his hand colored Sunday pages as well for that, and I'm also putting up bizarre stuff I find in my collection. I have production schedules from 1973 at DC. Let's show those. Old stories of mine, unpublished stuff. Whatever I can find that might be interesting.
Well, that's brilliant. So definitely, patreon.com, search for Paul Kupperberg. That's fantastic. I want to thank you again so much for joining us. I want to thank everyone for joining in. No, it's great and really appreciate it. If there's anything in the future you want us to give a shout out for you, please just send it our way and we'd be more than happy to do so.
Great.
So thanks again, everyone. And I really appreciate this is Saturday morning, I think, for you. So I really appreciate you taking the time out, really do. And thanks again, everyone, and all the best.
Thanks again, everyone, for joining us for this episode. My thanks again to Paul for taking the time out to speak with myself and the students of TASQ Art. If you can, be sure to follow Paul. He has a Patreon as well, so you'll hear us speak about that in the recording. But do go on to patreon.com, check out Paul Kupperberg, check out his work with Crazy 8 Press as well. Check out Direct Conversations, check out all of his work. Paul is still writing and producing, and he's one of the main guys, that you go to the cinema and you might see something, a character he's worked on. Go straight to the source, folks. Check out what he's doing now, see what's new and original with Paul. I know I will. So thanks again, everyone, for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider liking and subscribing, share with your friends and families or anyone you think might be interested in the podcast. Feel free to leave us a comment below and let us know what you think of these episodes, or you can reach out to us directly at info@tasqart.com. That's TASQART.com. Until next time, this has been a copyright production of Macaulay Consultancy 2025.